In today's presentation, we will discuss surviving spouse beneficiaries and their stretch options. Surviving spouse beneficiaries generally have more options than other types of beneficiaries. In order to preserve the unique options that a surviving spouse beneficiary has, the surviving spouse needs to be named the beneficiary outright, rather than naming a trust that benefits the surviving spouse as a beneficiary. The right stretch option for a surviving spouse will depend on several factors, like the type of account, the age of the deceased spouse, and whether or not they had reached their required beginning date before death, the age of the surviving spouse, and whether or not they have reached their required beginning date, or if they are below 59 and a half. Understanding each option and your client's needs will help a surviving spouse beneficiary make the best choice for their circumstance. We're going to begin today's discussion with qualified accounts, and one of the most important pieces of information when dealing with qualified accounts is determining whether or not the deceased spouse had reached their required beginning date before death. The required beginning date for traditional IRAs is April 1 of the year following the year the account holder reaches age 70 and a half. The required beginning date for employer plans is deferred to April 1 of the year following retirement if the account holder works past age 70 and a half and the plan is sponsored by the employer for which the participant is employed, and the participant is not more than a 5% owner of the employing company. Even though SEP IRAs and simple IRAs are employer plans, the IRS looks at them as traditional IRAs for purposes of this rule, meaning that required minimum distributions must begin by April 1 following the year the participant reaches age 70 and a half, regardless of whether or not they continue to work. We are going to begin this presentation discussing stretch options when the account holder has not yet reached their required beginning date before death. The first option is spousal continuation. A surviving spouse beneficiary has the unique ability to treat an IRA or pension account as their own without creating an income tax consequence. This option is only available to surviving spouses. If a surviving spouse elects continuation, any required distributions and or penalty tax will be based upon the surviving spouse's age. Spousal continuation can be elected at any time after the account holder's death. This option, however, is not available for 403B tax-sheltered annuity plans. Surviving spouse beneficiaries will have to choose one of the other available options for 403B plans. The second option is spousal rollover. A surviving spouse beneficiary can roll the deceased spouse's account over to the surviving spouse's own IRA or pension account. The receiving pension plan will have to accept rollover contributions, though. If the surviving spouse rolls a deceased spouse's account into their own IRA or pension account, any required distributions or penalty will be assessed based upon the surviving spouse's age. A surviving spouse rolls funds into their own account, they get the added benefit of naming their own beneficiary. That beneficiary will then have the same stretch options as if the surviving spouse had owned the account from the beginning. This applies to rollovers and continuations. The third choice allows the surviving spouse to treat the account as inherited and stretch the account based upon the deceased spouse's life. A surviving spouse beneficiary may wish to treat the account as inherited for a few reasons. This would allow a surviving spouse under age 59 and a half the ability to access funds without incurring the 10% penalty. It would also allow an older surviving spouse the ability to delay distributions until the younger deceased spouse would have started them. If the deceased spouse has not yet reached their required beginning date, the first RMD is not due until December 31 of the year the deceased spouse would have attained age 70 and a half. If an account is treated as inherited, each year's RMD for the years after the deceased spouse would have turned 70 and a half is calculated by referring to the single life table using the surviving spouse's actual age in that year. Let's look at a few examples. If a wife, age 64, passes away in 2016 before reaching her required beginning date, her husband, age 70, can choose to treat the account as inherited. There will be no distributions due until year 2023, when the wife would have attained age 70 and a half. In 2023, the surviving husband will be 77 years old. To determine the required distribution for 2023, we look to the single life table. The factor for a 77-year-old is 12.1. The December 31, 2022 account balance will be divided by 12.1 to determine the 2023 distribution amount. In 2024, the December 31, 2023 balance will be divided by the single life table factor for a 78-year-old, or 11.4, and so on for each year. The next two examples illustrate when someone younger than 59 and a half might want to treat an account as inherited. In this example, a 55-year-old husband dies in 2016, leaving his IRA to his surviving wife. She is age 50 and chooses to treat the account as inherited. Treating the account as inherited allows the wife the ability to access funds within the IRA without those distributions being subjected to the 10% early distribution penalty. Because her husband had not yet reached his required beginning date, there is no RMD due from the account until he would have reached age 70 and a half in year 2031. In year 2031, the wife would use the single life table to determine the factor needed to calculate the RMD. The single life factor for a 65-year-old is 21. The December 31, 2030 balance would be divided by 21 to determine the RMD due. In 2032, she would use the single life factor of a 66-year-old, or 20.2, to determine her RMD, and so on. Let's add a little bit to the previous example using the same facts. The husband passes away in 2016 at age 55, leaving his IRA to his 50-year-old wife. She chooses to treat the account as inherited in order to avoid the 10% penalty if she needs to access funds before age 59 and a half. As we discussed in the last slide, if she leaves the funds as inherited, she will have to start RMDs when her husband would have reached age 70 and a half in 2031. But a surviving spouse has the unique ability to change the way an account is treated and can opt at any time to treat the account as their own rather than inherited. So in year 2026, when the wife reaches age 60, she can roll the funds into her own IRA. This will allow her to delay RMDs until an even later date when she reaches age 70 and a half in 2036. Now we're going to begin talking about situations where the deceased spouse had reached their required beginning date before their death. Spousal continuation, which we discussed earlier, is available to surviving spouses when the deceased spouse had reached their required beginning date before death. Spousal continuation allows the surviving spouse to treat the account as their own. RMDs will be determined using the surviving spouse's age. However, if there is an RMD due for the deceased For the year of their death, it must be distributed out to the surviving spouse. And again, spousal continuation is not available for 403B accounts. Spousal rollover is also available when the deceased spouse had reached their required beginning date before death. The surviving spouse beneficiary can roll the inherited IRA into their own IRA or pension account if their pension accepts rollovers. After the funds are rolled over, the RMDs and any penalty associated with them will be determined using the surviving spouse's age. After the surviving spouse rolls the funds into her own name, she can name her own beneficiary. That beneficiary will have stretch options available to them as if the surviving spouse had been the account holder since the beginning. The rollover can be accomplished by 60-day rollover, which is unique for surviving spouses. Non-spouses do not have the option to do a 60-day rollover. It has to be a direct transfer. If an RMD is due for the deceased for the year of death, the surviving spouse must take the RMD before rolling the account over because required distributions are not eligible for rollover. If the deceased spouse had reached their required beginning date before death, the surviving spouse may still choose to treat the account as inherited. The RMD calculation for years following the year of death are determined by using the factor that is the longer of either the life expectancy of the deceased spouse under the single life table, using the deceased spouse in the year of death, and then subtracting one for each subsequent year, or the surviving spouse's life expectancy under the uniform lifetime table recalculated each year. If there is an RMD due for the year of death, it will need to be distributed to the surviving spouse beneficiary. Let's look at an example of how this might work. In this example, the wife, age 71, passes away. Her husband and sole beneficiary is 90 years old. He decides to treat the account as inherited. In order to determine the RMD, we need to look at both the husband and wife's life expectancies and see whose is longest. We look to the single life table to determine the wife's factor. In her year of death, the factor for a 71-year-old is 16.3. We subtract 1 from that factor for the year after death, leaving us with a factor of 15.3. The husband's factor for the year after death comes from the uniform table. The factor for a 91-year-old is 10.8. The wife's factor of 15.3 would be used to determine the RMD because it is the longest of the two. In following years, the husband would subtract 1 from the factor used in the previous year and compare it to his factor on the uniform life table to see which factor is bigger, and he would use the largest of the two. We're going to change gears a little bit and talk about non-qualified deferred annuities for a few minutes. Generally, if a surviving spouse is named as beneficiary, that surviving spouse has the ability to choose spousal continuation of the contract. This allows the surviving spouse to delay distributions and therefore the taxes associated with those distributions until his or her death. As we touched on earlier, if a trust that benefits the surviving spouse is named as beneficiary rather than the surviving spouse herself, the ability to continue the contract or treat it as her own is probably lost. If the surviving spouse chooses continuation and is below age 59 and a half, any distributions will be subjected to the 10% early distribution penalty. A surviving spouse younger than 59 and a half can elect to treat the account as inherited if they feel like they will need to access the funds before age 59 and a half in order to avoid the 10% penalty. Every beneficiary's situation is different, and their needs are unique to their circumstances. Surviving spouses have several options that are not available to non-spouse beneficiaries. Surviving spouses can make changes to their stretch selections, and this can be used as a planning tool, especially for those under age 59 and a half. Understanding all of the options available can allow you to help your clients make the best decision for their circumstances. Thanks for listening in today.